Here any minute.
And with that, I'd like to introduce Jeff Hickman, the new Speaker of the House. Hickman was elected to the position just about a week ago. He grew up in Cherokee, and after earning a degree in journalism from the University of Oklahoma, he worked as press secretary for OU President David Boren. He moved later to Woodward to become vice president of the Omni Media Group. And Hickman was first elected to the House in 2005 and represents Alfalfa, Major, Woods, and Woodward counties. Please join me in welcoming Speaker of the House, Jeff Hickman.
Jeff's taller than I am, so I have to move this down here. Well, thank you all for being here, and welcome to your state capitol. As bad a shape as it may be in, but we're glad you're here, and welcome. This is always a fun time to have the publishers here, and I don't know how many members have had a chance to visit with you. I've had that opportunity. Thanks to Mr. Booyer, who always drags me in to visit with you all when you're here. And it's a great privilege for us to have you at the Capitol building. So thank you for being here. More importantly, though, thank you for what you're doing at home. What you're doing at home is far more important than anything that we're doing here. And thank you for the commitment that you have to the communities you serve and the things that you do to keep those communities alive. That's the things I worry about as some of our publishers are getting older and thinking about retirement and thinking about leaving the newspaper business. Not to focus on any one person in particular, like one sitting to my right that I grew up with and whose children I went to school with. The community newspapers are so important to the sense of community that we have. And there is, and I'll just single out Mr. Booyer, there may be other weekly newspapers in the state that are as good as the Cherokee Messenger and Republican, but there are none better. And I appreciate the commitment that he's made to our community and our part of the state. I accept cash only, Steve, no credit cards.
I'm looking to see about that.
But that's so true of so many of our communities. The weekly newspapers really are the lifeblood of the community, and it's so important. And to those of you who are here that put out those weekly papers, and some weeks are a little tougher than others, and some years the economy is a little tougher than others. But it's so important what you're doing, not only telling the story each week, excuse me, but chronicling the history and for families and for generations to come, and it's very important. And it's not a dying business by any stretch of the imagination, and it's a very important part of our community. So thank you to those of you who are in that business and are here each and every week. I'm a little bit biased because I have a journalism degree and believe in what you all do. I think it's very important. But I just want to say that. Let me talk just briefly about some of the things that I see going on at the Capitol and the long tenure that I've been Speaker of the House, speaking from my experience over the last few days, and then would be very interested in answering your questions. Because I think that will be much more interesting for you. And Lynn Martin's not allowed to ask any questions about my wedding that he photographed or any other personal matters like that. We're facing a difficult budget year. We thought our revenue situation might improve. We were facing a $170 million budget shortfall compared to what we had to appropriate last year. And we really hoped this week when we got numbers that would have improved. Instead, it got worse. And so we're looking at more like $188 million, somewhere in that range, of less money that we have to appropriate this year than we did in the previous year. So that is a challenge for us to figure out how to do that. That doesn't mean that we're necessarily taking in less revenue. What we have done as a state over a long period of time is to earmark certain funds or certain items that money would come off the top. You hear the term off the top. Money would be set aside. It would come in from certain funds. It would come in for certain purposes, and that money would be set aside so the obligation will be met first. We have done so much of that when you take that money out first, then what's left is why you're seeing these declines. And so we have earmarked a great deal of items in Oklahoma, whether it's roads and bridges, whether it's the OLAP program. There's a number of things that come off the top. When you do that, you ensure those things get unlimited funding or the amount of funding that they need or were promised. But you also take away the legislature's ability to be able to move dollars around. The people that you elect and send here no longer have that option because that money it comes off the top and it's not available for appropriation. And so it ties our hands in years like this. That's kind of where we find ourselves this year. So that's part of the challenge. Our economy is still strong. Oklahoma is still doing well, but we will have less money to appropriate than we did last year when you look at the obligations that have taken that money off the top. So that's a challenge. We have great needs, and the needs have not decreased in critical areas that I've worked the last few years that I've chaired the Public Safety Budget Committee. Areas like corrections. I have 3 prisons in my district in northwest Oklahoma that I represent, and I don't need a study to tell me what the situation is in corrections. I see those people that work in those facilities. They're my friends and neighbors. I see them at ball games. I see them at the grocery store. I see them at restaurants. I know the situation in our prisons, and it really is a crisis. We're paying $11.83 an hour, and in the economy that we find ourselves in, fortunately in Oklahoma, you can go make 3 times that in the oil field in northwest Oklahoma and not deal with 1,000 buckleheads while you're the only person on the shift overnight with nothing but a flashlight with people you really wouldn't want to invite over for dinner on a regular occasion. It's a wonder that we're 60% staffed in our prisons. I'm amazed that we have the number of employees that we do still on the job. We're fortunate that we do. But it's beyond critical. We are in a crisis in our prison system with 100% capacity plus and 60% staffing. So that's one of the challenges that we face. How do we deal with that? State troopers, another issue we worked on. We have a critical shortage of troopers. It's becoming more difficult to attract troopers to what is probably the toughest and best law enforcement academy of its kind. But there are now 25 or so police departments or sheriff's offices that pay more than the Oklahoma Highway Patrol. It used to be the top job in law enforcement. It's pretty tough to attract a person to go to the patrol academy, and they won't know where they're going to live when they get out, whether they'll be in Idabel or Boise City or on the turnpike between Tulsa and Oklahoma City. They don't know where they're going to live. They know that they'll be there by themselves, where if something happens, help is only 20 to 30 minutes away, best case scenario. Or they can go work for the Edmond Police Department or the Norman Police Department and make more money, know where they're going to live, and know that if something goes wrong, help will only be minutes away. And their family, they know exactly where they're going to live. You can now make more as a police officer in my district in Woodward, Oklahoma, than you can as a state trooper with pay raises they've recently done. So that's the challenge that we face in law enforcement, particularly in the Highway Patrol. And our patrol is getting older, and there's a large percentage of the force that's eligible to retire if they wanted to walk out the door today. So that's the situation. And these are positions, DHS is the same way. We have DHS employees that we require to have a bachelor's degree that we pay top end less than $25,000 in some of those critical caseworker roles. So I mentioned that just as these are critical issues that we face as a state that are not positions where we can simply say when someone calls the Highway Patrol for help, or DHS has a child that's endangered, or there's no one's available to work at the prison. You can't just say, well, we'll just leave the inmates overnight, we'll just lock the gate, we'll check on them in the morning. Tell that person that's on the phone with the dispatcher that we don't have a trooper available. If they get called back Wednesday between 8 and 5, we'll have someone that can go help them. Those aren't options for us. These are core services that we have to figure out a way to take care of, and those are important issues that we face. This building, probably one of the most beautiful museums, definitely in the state. It's a beautiful building. It is in terrible shape. It's an embarrassment that you all come here to visit your state capitol and you can't walk through the front door. There are yellow barricades across the front, and you need to be real careful that a piece of the outside of the building doesn't fall on you as you're walking in. And I hope we don't have one of those earthquakes that happens just right around this area and shakes this corner of the building where all the scaffolding is, because we very well could have someone killed. You've heard about the plumbing situation. The bottom floor was, when the building was built almost 100 years ago, was a dirt floor. They came in and put asphalt over the top of the dirt, not concrete, and then put the terrazzo floor on top of that. Those sewer lines have broken down. The sewage is in the soil under the building. It's a very unfortunate situation. Even more unfortunate, as I'm told, the Jim Thorpe building across the way where the Corporation Commission is in even worse shape than this building. Hasn't had air conditioning for the last few summers that I know of. So we have great needs because we've just not managed these assets that belong to the people of this state for decades. well before I got here 10 years ago. So that's an issue. And how do we address that? There was an attempt to address it with cash out of the budget last year. There's discussion about doing a bond issue. There's discussion about sending a bond issue to a vote of the people. There's discussion about the rainy day fund. What are those options? And we're looking at all those options, and I'm trying to determine from our House members in the short time that I've been in the Speaker's office what they want to do and what they feel like the best option would be to repair this building. There are so many other issues. The Native American Cultural Center down the road that's been started but not finished. There are some that I think the Senate moved a bill on that today. I'm hearing from my members that we have one museum here that you're sitting in now that we can't seem to take care of, and then we have another one that we haven't finished building down the road. How do we prioritize that? Where do we start? So great needs in terms of our Capitol building, the governor's mansion, and then just throughout the state of state property that's not been maintained. So significant issues that we face there. Making progress on our pension funds. Randy McDaniel continues to do a great job of dealing with that. We'll continue to have conversations there, but I think we're moving in the right direction on getting our retirement systems healthier. And we've been able to do that without a lot of the fights that you've seen in other states where you start talking about making reforms in other areas. And so far, we've been able to work with those involved. We've been able to make changes that would only affect new hires, not anyone currently employed or anyone currently retired. And I think that's why we've been able to maneuver that successfully without having protests outside the building here like you've seen in other states. Judicial reform is an issue that there's been a lot of talk about. I'm not sensing that there's a great deal of appetite for that on the House side. There may be some things we need to look at within the court, but we have to be cautious, I think, when we look at a third branch of government. It will surprise everyone in the room for me to say this, but every once in a while the legislature makes mistakes. Sometimes we get things wrong, and I know that's a shock to everyone in the room. But the good part about the legislative branch is we can fix that. We can come back and pass another law. We can come back next session and correct something. If there was an unintended consequence of a piece of legislation, we can correct that. The executive branch, much the same way. The executive branch makes mistakes, but they're usually mistakes you can fix. The judicial branch is different. When the judicial branch makes a mistake, sometimes you can't fix it. If you execute the wrong person, if you lock someone up for 10 years that shouldn't have been there, it's just different. When the judicial branch makes a mistake, sometimes it can't be fixed. And so I think we, as the legislative branch, have to be very cautious when we start talking about making wholesale changes to the judicial branch. Are there things we can do better? Are there ways we can improve? Are there things that are needed? Probably so. And we need to have that conversation. There's nothing wrong with that conversation. But to start talking about making wholesale changes and to not remember our history of why some of these things were put in place in Oklahoma, I think if we don't go back and look at how we got here, we would be remiss in terms of making changes going forward. Representative Dank likes to tell the story of when he was but a young child, maybe not a child, but he remembers being here at the Capitol when hearings were held. We had the scandal with the Supreme Court justices, and justices were brought into committee rooms like this at the Capitol and were questioned about things going on in the court. And he specifically remembers a justice that was asked, when was the last time you did not take a bribe for a case that was before you? And said the room was just completely silent. And after probably at least 60 seconds, maybe 120 seconds, the justice finally said, I can't remember the last case in which I did not take a bribe. That was in the 60s in Oklahoma. There's a reason this system has been put in place. Now, do we need to look at it and look at maybe making some reforms and some changes? Sure, we can have that conversation. But I don't sense from our members on the House side that they're ready to scorch the earth in terms of the judicial branch. I think we need to be very cautious in terms of that issue. Obviously, the tax issue is one that's being discussed on a couple of different fronts, both the income tax as well as gross production tax, two major issues. Of course, the tax cut was put into the same legislation as the Capitol building repairs last year, and the Supreme Court found that to be log rolling and set that aside, as everyone knows. And so there's discussion. The governor's proposed an income tax cut in her budget where cuts would be made to pay for that. There are 4 or 5 different bills before the House involving the income tax. I think the Senate has some proposals. I'm not sure what they're sending over to us. That will continue to be a conversation, and our tax structure needs to be a conversation. But we like to compare ourselves to Texas, who doesn't have an income tax, and that's important in terms of business and industry and corporate leaders deciding where they're going to locate their businesses. But Texas also taxes a lot of things we don't. They tax services. They tax dry cleaning and landscape services and oil changes and diaper services. I mean, there's a lot of things that are taxed in Texas that we don't tax in Oklahoma. It's probably getting very close to time to have a complete look at our entire tax structure. We've kind of whittled away here or there on different pieces of it and made little changes, but at some point, if we want to get serious about it, we probably need to look at the entire structure. And do we greatly reduce or eliminate the income tax, and do we replace it with a tax on services or other things? Governor Keating, I think, attempted that, and I know the banking industry and others that weren't at the table pushed back really hard, and that wasn't pursued. But if we're going to have this discussion, I think it needs to be a look at the entire tax structure. That doesn't mean that we're not going to move a tax cut bill forward this year. There's a couple of different options that are out there. There's some that have some triggers that go into effect when revenues increase. There are some that are deferred to a future year. There are others that are phased in over several years. And we're having that discussion within our House caucus about what do we want to do? What are the best options? And we'll have those discussions. Because we do want to be competitive, obviously, with our neighboring states. Kansas has drastically cut their rate. Texas doesn't have one. But what does our entire picture look like? And that's what I hope we can bring to the discussion, is looking at the entire picture. And hopefully, and you can't do it in 1 year, but we need to start having a conversation about our entire tax structure in Oklahoma. There's nothing magic in the Red River when you drive south on I-35. There's nothing magical at all in the water. But when you cross that Red River and get into the other side, there's something that's been created in the legal climate of the tax structure that has encouraged businesses to grow and thrive there. And so I think we need to be thoughtful about looking at that and just seeing what else can be done. The last thing I'll mention to you as a major issue that you're hearing about is the gross production tax. And that's an issue that I'm starting to try to dig into and learn more about, because it's not an area that I was involved in when all this was put together several years ago. But it's one that I think the House needs to be very involved in going forward. Gross production tax in Oklahoma is 7%. Vertical wells pay 7%. Horizontal wells are paying an effective rate of 1%. And that's been changed over the last several years. It used to be a rebate program. Now effectively it's a 1% rate. That incentive expires in about a year. And so we have to have the conversation about, do we let that return to 7%? Are there other incentives we need to put in place? What do we need to do? That program used to be a reduced rate until the well paid out, and then it went back up to the 7%. Now it's a 4-year incentive that for 4 years that you pay 1%. So we're going to have conversations with the industry. Those have been ongoing with the House and Senate and the Governor's office before I became Speaker, and we'll be having those conversations. But we're also going to have conversations with mineral owners. Where I come from, the people in my district that have oil and gas interests get a check, and that gross production tax is being paid by them out of their check. So there's more to the party than just the oil and gas companies. And we obviously own a lot of minerals in the state too, but we need to make sure we're including everybody that this affects in the discussion. We don't want to do anything that would cause, my district borders Kansas. I want that wealth created and those wells drilled on the south side of that line. I want that to happen in Oklahoma. So we have to be very thoughtful. We don't want to do anything that pushes that drilling just across the border into Kansas or to Texas or our neighboring states. But we also realize that 1% is not where we're going to ultimately be able to be. So we'll have all those conversations. That will be a major issue that we either will deal with this year or we'll defer it into next year and deal with it when we come back next session before that finally implements. But a very significant issue for the state, particularly all the oil and gas activity that we have before us. So I'll stop there, and I hope I didn't bore you with too many details or any deeper than what you'd want to go on these items. But thank you again for taking time to come down and be here and spend some time with your legislators and be at the Capitol and find out what's going on. I wish you all could be here every day. Not that I don't like the folks on the outside of the room that are here every day, but it's great to see people from home. It's great to see people that have the best interests of Oklahoma at heart. We may disagree about how we get there, but I think everybody in this room agrees that they want to see Oklahoma thrive and move forward, or you wouldn't be in the business you're in. And that's why it's a real privilege for me to get to spend a little time with you today. Any questions? As if there wouldn't be from this group.
Any leadership changes coming, or
Yeah.
is it all taking place?
I've changed up the leadership team as would be expected. Any speaker that comes in obviously changes up their leadership team. That's really for those of you that aren't involved in inside baseball here. The speaker each week meets with his leadership team. It's really kind of like your cabinet or just a group of advisors to communicate, hear what other members are interested in, and share ideas. And so I made some changes there, not a lot of changes, but took a few members off the speaker chair and added some to it. Our caucus continues to grow with 72 members. I think it's important to have a leadership team that is reflective not only of the opinions of 72 very independent-minded Republicans, but also just the size. And so we've expanded that team and added some more members to that. I haven't gotten into the point of making any final decisions on committee makeup, committee chairman, because when I took over, we already were in committee work. The bills had all been assigned to committees. The committees were already meeting. All of that had been done, and I think it would have been very disruptive for me to come in and say, well, I'm the new Speaker of the House. I'm appointing the entire structure. And so we have another week of committee work, and so I'll be looking at all that, but I'm not anticipating making any wholesale changes in that process. Will we look at some different areas that we may need to? Sure, I'll be looking at that, but I'm sure not planning to take out all the committee chairmen and bring in all new committee chairmen in the middle of the legislative session. I think that's very difficult. I did talk to Speaker Benj. He told me he's already checked the calendar to make sure that he's going to be the longest serving Republican speaker, then I can't beat him if I stay for 3 years. He came in on the first day of session, if I remember right, when the previous speaker stepped down, and so he was there a week or two before I was. We came in session had already started, but a similar situation. I always wondered why we elect speaker designates that are determined 6 months to a year out. I didn't really know why we did that. I completely understand why we do that now when you take over with a couple of hours notice. It's definitely a little different challenge. Yes, Paul?
I was wondering, the economy's doing fairly well in Oklahoma. Our unemployment rate's good compared to a lot of places.
Right.
We're supposedly one of the rapidly growing economies in Oklahoma City. All these things, what's so wrong with our tax structure, and why do we want to keep comparing to Texas?
Sure. Well, and I think what I'm hearing from the members is that's what they're hearing from business and industry. Why is ConocoPhillips in Houston instead of in Bartlesville or Ponca City? Why is J.C. Penney in Plano, Texas instead of in Tulsa? And so that's the conversation our members have is why are we not locating some of those companies? Now we have a lot of great companies that are here. I think you make a very valid point. And that's why I'm thinking that we may continue to address some of these on an incremental basis, but at some point we do need to look at the overall picture. Representative DeWitt just yesterday was sharing with me his district. He lives in Brayman. His district's north central Oklahoma. He farms and has some land in Kansas. And he said, I can tell you I don't want us to adopt the entire Kansas tax structure because I know what I'm paying them for property tax on my farm ground in Kansas. So the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. It's our job to kind of sort that out and make sure we're being responsible. I think you raise a very valid point, and so we'll continue to look at things that help make us competitive. I know the governor's, the Commerce Department, those people are always having those conversations with business and industry. We don't ever want to be satisfied with what we do have, because if you decide this is where we want to be, this is just great. If you're not growing, you're going the other direction. It's hard to just stay right at the same point. I had that experience when I was running for office. Originally in 2004, I remember knocking on the door of this couple and having a chance to visit with them and talk about, well, I hope we can do some things to improve our economy in northwest Oklahoma, that we can bring jobs and grow our population. This lady looked me right in the eye and said, the reason I live in this town is because I like the size of this town. I don't want it any bigger. Well, if you're not growing, you're going the other direction. But she didn't want to hear any part of making anything any bigger and bringing any more jobs to Fairview, Oklahoma, because she was perfectly happy where she was.
I think I have just one quick follow-up
Sure.
to that. And this would be more for rural areas like our small newspapers serve. But housing in rural areas, we got a lot of people who love to live in our small towns.
Right.
Especially with the oil boom and everything in certain parts. There's nowhere for them to live. Has anybody ever thought about maybe housing's a problem?
Yeah, that's an issue that, in fact, my first term up here, Todd Hyatt was the speaker, and we did rural economic development issue, traveled the state, put legislation forward. We couldn't ultimately get it all the way through that he carried as Speaker of the House. There's been some tax credit issues the last few years, but tax credits are tough to pass when you're trying to deal with the budget situation like it is. But we've been having those conversations. For the 10 years I've been here, that's been something that I've been talking about. In fact, it's gotten to the point where I finally threw up my hands and invited Mark McBride, the new state representative from Moore, to come to Alva and Cherokee last year. There was such a need there with the oil boom like you're talking about. And Representative McBride is a home builder in Moore. He had gone to college at Northwestern, has children in Northwestern. His family owns a ranch at Bass Junction, so he has a tie to our area. And I brought him up to look around, and he said, wow, there's not been anything other than big custom homes built here since I was in college in 1980. I said, I know, that's what I've been trying to tell you for the last couple of months. He said, well, I just thought you meant there weren't very many. He said, there really hasn't been much built at all for the school teacher and the pumper that works for Chesapeake that are buying their first home, or the older couple that's retiring and want to downsize. And it's not just small communities. I mean, Jeff can tell you in Enid, it's even that way in larger communities where we have a real need for housing in this state. It's really been a challenge. So much so that I finally got Representative McBride up there, and he said, well, I want to build some homes here, but he said, I want you to be my partner. I said, well, that's perfect. I'm the perfect partner for building houses. The only thing I don't know is how to build a house. Other than that, I'm the perfect partner. And so we have started now 3 spec homes in Alva and 1 in Cherokee, and just got to the point where somebody had to do something. And there are some other houses being built now because of the economic opportunity. But it's tough in our rural communities too, though, because the infrastructure is not in place, and the communities can't afford to go in and put streets and water lines and sewer lines, and sometimes it's harder to go through purchasing lots. Abstracts take more time. City inspectors sometimes in smaller towns operate a little slower, and so it's been a real challenge for us, and we've got to experience firsthand the challenges involved in that. But the land's not available. We have all this wide open space, but you and I like to run a tractor over it rather than developing it into lots. We're not smart enough to realize we could probably make more if we divided it up into lots than what we're going to make on a wheat crop there this year. But it's to the point where we are trying to do that. It's been a real challenge for us to find lots and to be able to do that. But we just decided to step out there and take a chance. And you don't want to get too far ahead of yourself in case something happens and you can't sell them. But housing is a very, very critical need for us in Oklahoma. Very critical. And with the tornadoes in Woodward and Moore and other places, even in the urban areas, it's become a challenge. It's brought more contractors to the state, and that's one of the reasons Representative McBride has been able to utilize some of his contractors. With the tornado, it brought more contractors in, and so it's freed up some of those other guys to be able to do some things in outlying areas. There's a question over here somewhere. I thought I saw it.
Are your spec homes on the shoreline of Canton Lake there?
Well,
if you can find shoreline.
If you can determine, you have to have water in your lake to have a shoreline, don't you? Canton's just outside of my district, but that sure has had a tough effect on us. It's really dry. I'm sure hoping we get some rain very soon. A lot of the other parts of the state have received rain, but specifically that area around Canton has not, and the lake is still. Last time I checked, and Paul may know, last time I checked it was about 13 feet below normal.
It's awful. We need a lot of rain in Woodward, to be honest with you, to get it flowing down the Canadian. And the problem, and really part of the untold story last year when we went through all that was, that Canton Lake is obviously has great recreational purposes for those of us in Northwest Oklahoma, and tourism dollars it generates and all of that. That's also the reserve for Oklahoma City, and when they drew down what they drew down, they basically took everything they had in a reserve, and that was kind of the untold story. If you were in Oklahoma City, if you wanted to be concerned, it was there's really nothing else to send you. Fortunately, it's been raining here in Oklahoma City. Lake Hefner actually filled up, and they sent downstream more water than they took out of Canton a couple of weeks after they took that water out of the lake there. But the concerning part for Oklahoma City is if it does get dry again, there's nothing in Canton for them to draw from. When you're 13 feet below, the reserve is gone. And so that's something, if I were in Oklahoma City, I'd be very concerned about, is that my reserve is now depleted. Joe's being awful quiet down there at the end of the table. I'm putting him to sleep, or he doesn't have a good question.
We're doing fine.
About taxes, though, isn't it?
I'd be disappointed if you didn't ask.
I won't. I'm more interested in, you see any way we can help corrections other than going to private prisons? And our private prisons is the real answer right now, immediate. And if so, is that going to cost us more? I assume it will than using our own prisons. And on the improvements to the Capitol, we can assume that something's going to be done this year or not.
I mean, something needs to be done. I think that where there is complete agreement in this building is that something has to be done. The question is, how do we do it? But I'm hopeful. Yeah, they're telling me that construction costs on average are increasing about 6% every year. So every year we put it off. I mean, either way, we've got a debt. I mean, if you if you look at the bond issue, you obviously have debt. But if you defer this to the next generation and keep kicking the can down the road, you're creating debt on future legislatures and our children and grandchildren because the costs are going to get greater. So either way, we have the debt. I hope we can make a decision somehow to at least get started. Kansas, though, did theirs in phases. I think it ended up costing them 3 times. I think they spent like $300 million or something like that. Someone told me on what they thought was going to be a $100 million project because they did it in phases. So I'm hopefully optimistic we can reach some type of an agreement this year and have a plan for this building going forward. Because it's going to get to the point where it's not going to be usable, it's not going to be safe. The capital architect told us this week that he doesn't know if it's going to be next week, next month, next year, or 2 years down the road. There will come a point when you go to flush a toilet in this building and it's not going to flush. I mean, the plumbing system is beyond critical. The electrical system is still the old, what do they call it, the tooth and, Tim may know, what do they call the old system where it's got the, is it knob and tooth? Is that what I'm talking about? You got all that equipment in the back of your shop, don't you know?
He was there before that.
Oh, okay. He has all that high-tech equipment now. Tim's moved beyond. So when you go in, I mean, and you wouldn't build a building the way this building was built. I mean, the plumbing and the electrical, everything, but you have to knock the plaster out to get to it. There's going to be some asbestos issues when you do. But while you have the plaster out to address the plumbing needs, you might as well fix the electrical wiring that's been there since 1917. That it's a wonder it hasn't burned the building down at this point. So it's one of those that if you say, well, we'll just address the plumbing needs, well, you've already got the plaster knocked out. Why don't you take care of the wiring while you're in there as well? The entire basement will have to be gutted, if nothing else, because of the situation beneath the Capitol and the sewage that leaks down into the earth beneath the Capitol. The way that the dirt floor is just covered up. So we know for a fact that the entire basement will have to be gutted. We hope we can do it in such a way where the legislature would still be able to meet here, and that's going to have to be part of the project. But you have a lot of relocation costs if you start moving people out of the building. But we know that the rest of the building is really a beautiful building. In terms of cosmetic issues, there's not a lot of cosmetic issues you need to do to the building. It's a beautiful building. It's infrastructure and plumbing, sewage, so you don't have to spend a lot on cosmetic. So you don't need to come in and gut the entire rotunda and start over, for example. You have a good framework to work from there. The basement is really the only floor if you're going to have to gut the entire building. Back to your first 7 questions, though, Steve. Corrections is a very complicated problem that's been created over decades. And it's going to require a complicated solution, in my opinion. We didn't get into this situation overnight. We're not going to get out of it overnight. It's going to, in my opinion, require all options to be on the table. We are so overcrowded in our prisons, we are so backed up into our county jails that private prisons are going to be a part of that solution. How else do you relieve the overcrowding in our state prisons? The good news for taxpayers in Oklahoma is we have 2 private prisons sitting empty in this state, and they're owned by competing companies. The Corrections Department has gone out they put out a request for proposal that they've gotten back for both of those facilities, and so they'll be reviewing that to determine what that was going to cost to get additional beds. The downside is that we could take the bid from either of those private prisons and reopen one of those private prisons in Watonga or Hinton, where they're located. GEO owns a prison in Hinton. CCA owns a prison in Watonga. We do business with them at other facilities in the state already. You could take a contract with either of those and open one of those facilities, and just with what we have backed up in county jails would fill up one of those private prisons. So the need is great, but in terms of an immediate way to relieve the stress on our bed space in our state prisons, that's an option that's out there. But it costs money. You've got to pay for the beds, and the department does not have existing money set aside that they can do that with. So that's part of it. Looking at those that we're supervising, we've put on the books that these inmates will be supervised when they leave. That was one of the things we discovered in the last few years. We get a large number of inmates that were leaving prison that didn't check in with a parole officer, that weren't accountable to anyone. They just walked out, and that was the last we heard from them. And so we passed legislation through JRI that those inmates would be supervised, but we have not funded the Department of Corrections to hire the parole officers to do it. So the people aren't placed to do that. That's another piece of the puzzle that's important. We've had the situation with some halfway houses that's being investigated by the department currently. But we're also looking to make sure that if we're stepping inmates down at the right point, are we moving inmates out of a bed into a halfway house when they're eligible, or are we holding them longer? And do we have a system in place to do that? A lot of this could be done, and Director Jones used to tell me this, all they need is an updated computer system to track all this stuff, but we never did fund that. And so a system that would manage this so that it automatically happened versus staff having to go in manually pull files and figure out who's supposed to move where on any given day. So a lot of it's technology upgrades that we need. The new corrections director is here. I met him for the first time this week. He comes from Arizona, where they face a lot of the similar challenges that we face here. He's been very involved in supervising private prison contracts and halfway houses to make sure they are accountable. So he may be the right person right now, particularly with that halfway house incident he's walking into, to be able to evaluate that and make sure that we're having inmates in a safe place that's going to follow the rules. So it's a very complicated problem that does not have an easy answer. The solution will be as complicated as the problem, but we have to find a solution. We talk about we don't want the federal government coming and telling us how to operate our state. We're not that far removed from the federal government running our prison system, and if we don't address it, they'll be back here running that. And we're just one lawsuit or one phone call from the Department of Justice away from them taking over our system again, in my opinion.
You brought me back to my tax question now.
Sure.
We've got all these money problems,
Yeah.
and we're still wanting to cut taxes.
Yeah. And
I understand growth through revenue, but
Right.
that takes time too.
Right.
If you immediately cut the taxes, that's immediate cut to the money you've got to spend on immediate problems.
Sure. And that's why there's a number of different bills out here, and we have passed tax bills before that have triggers in them that only go into effect when there is growth revenue. I think in my time that I've been at the Capitol, any of the tax cuts we've done have all been paid for through growth revenue. So I don't know what that looks like at the end of the day, or if we reach an agreement with the House, the Senate, and the governor. But there's a lot of different options available, whether it's a deferred tax cut. There are those that argue that we need to make the cut now so that we do stimulate our economy and have growth. But that's part of the discussion. It's definitely complicated, that discussion, to have a $188 million budget hole. So it's going to be a challenge, but the governor said that that's something that we need to have the conversation about, and we're having it within our own caucus. But to tell you right now that I can tell you what the House position will be or what the House bill will look like on the income tax today, I don't have that answer yet from my caucus, but we'll continue to have those discussions. One last question? Yes, sir.
David Fritzian with Oklahoma Watch. Just a question. Everyone needs money, but I have to ask, what do you think the education funding should look like, or
Sure.
will look like
Sure.
at the end of the session?
Well, again, with the budget hole that we're facing, the hope for a lot of new funding is really not there, and that doesn't mean we won't find some ways. But when you face a budget shortfall, the only way you increase revenue to one area is to cut revenue and cut appropriations to other areas. So if we're going to increase funding to one entity, that means we have to cut in other areas in a situation like this. Education has some great needs in terms of operational dollars. Would be my position on that. In the 10 years that I've been here, we've not done a lot in the area of operational dollars. We've done a couple of teacher pay raises, but we have not done operational dollars. On just the revenue to keep fuel in the buses that's gone up. The price of a gallon of gas is a lot different today than it was 10 years ago. Just the money to keep the lights on and the doors open. All of those expenses that school districts incur each and every year. Now, they've had some growth in local property tax and other areas, but in terms of state dollars, we haven't done a lot in terms of operations. And we've also passed some things that we've required them to spend money on, some mandates we've put in place that we haven't funded as well. So my real concern is to try to hopefully at some point get some discretionary dollars or operational dollars to our school districts to let them spend as those local school boards see fit. whether that's on paying above the salary schedule or it's just paying the light bill. I think we need to get some dollars like that to our schools. Particularly, I know that's been a challenge in our rural communities. It's just operational dollars. So I can't stand here and tell you that something's going to happen in that area this session with the budget situation that we find ourselves in. But it's something that I'm very aware of is a real need, the operational side in particular. We also are continuing to face a teacher shortage. We have not done state employee pay raises. Teachers had a raise since state employees have had a raise, and so obviously our critical needs and corrections and Iowa Patrol, DHS, and other areas are important as well. But we also are seeing a great need for teachers. Even in Woodward, which is the largest community in my district, who has never had trouble finding teachers, they went all last year with 2 or 3 positions unfilled because they couldn't find teachers in and around the Woodward, Oklahoma area. Not to mention the smaller schools that are struggling with that. So teacher shortage is a very real issue that we're going to have to deal with as a state. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I don't know if it's just pay, but I think pay is probably a part of that. But I don't know how we address teacher pay this year without addressing corrections pay when our corrections employees have not had a raise since the last time the teachers did. And we really are in a life and death situation at some of our prisons. So it's going to be tough to prioritize all that and figure out what needs to happen first, because I know there's some great needs in education. But my hope is that when we do have those dollars, that we can put them into operations and give the local school districts discretion on how they choose to spend those dollars. Thanks, David. Question. Mark, anything else?
Thank you for always being a friend.
Well, thank you all for being here today.